The Syrian president under mounting pressures. Protests spread across the country despite a series of concessions. So is revolution in Syria taking root, and at what price? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. Bashar al-Assad's government has promised more political freedoms and the lifting of the country's emergency law. Yet despite this, the unrest in Syria continues. And in what appears to be the most serious threat to his family's 40-year rule, protests have now spread from the southern city of Daraa to Damascus, Hama, Homs, Latakia and other cities. In a country where the regime is known for its tight grip on security, the growing number of casualties may come as no surprise in what is quickly becoming an increasingly unstable Syria. Tariq Baisley has more.
Tens of thousands of Syrians on the streets of the capital, but not in protest. Their demonstration, one of support for their president. The centre of Damascus was brought to a standstill, their adoration in response to events outside the capital. This unverified video is claimed to show victims from Saturday's violence in Latakia. Witnesses say police opened fire indiscriminately while snipers targeted individuals from nearby rooftops.
We rallied and started to march to another mosque in peaceful demonstration. At the time we reached, we were met by fire, live fire. They are firing from behind the police lines, and the police and security forces are standing still, doing nothing at all.
Officials admit a small number of deaths. Those at the protest put the number at least 20. Among them, this man, 26-year-old shop owner, Wael. His brother, speaking to Al Jazeera, confirmed that he was shot in the head on his way home from work.
A sniper shot him. It went into his head and went to hospital. They told us he was dead and they did not release the body.
President Bashar al-Assad now faces his deepest crisis in 11 years in power. He's pulled police and soldiers back from the mostly Sunni city of Daraa, where the statue of his father, the former president, was defaced on Friday. He's also released hundreds of political prisoners. A presidential advisor has blamed Sunni religious leader Yusuf al-Qaradawi for inciting the revolt and trying to stir sectarian tensions. On Friday, the sheikh told followers,
"Today the train of revolutions arrived at a station that was inevitable it would reach, the station of Syria."
The regime is trying to incite and fuel sectarian hatred, and this will be the scapegoat.
Further graphic evidence of Friday's violence in the southern town of Daraa has also been posted to the internet. The killings and reports of new deaths are only likely to give momentum to the protesters' demands for change. Tariq Baisley, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's discuss some of these issues with our guests. In London, Syrian journalist Malik Al-Abdeh. In Washington, D.C., Andrew Tabler, fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Mr. Tabler lived and worked in Syria for almost a decade and is the author of a soon-to-be-released book called In the Lion's Den, an eyewitness account of America's war with Syria. And joining us here in Doha, Blake Hounsfield. He is the managing editor of Foreign Policy magazine. Thank you all for being with us on this edition of Inside Story. Blake Hounsfield, the Syrian government is blaming the unrest on foreign powers. Who exactly is Syria accusing for the unrest, and how credible are these accusations?
Well, I think it's following the usual dictator playbook that we've seen used across the region. In this case, the Syrian regime is blaming Egyptians and Israelis for stirring up unrest in their country. But I think everyone can see with their plain eyes, these are ordinary Syrians who just want, some measure of economic justice and political rights. I don't know whether Syrians are ready to call for the end of the Assad regime yet, but certainly they're unhappy and they want a better future.
Malik Al-Abdeh, is there any credence to the accusations made by the government that the demonstrators are essentially tools in foreign hands?
No, I don't think so. There's no evidence whatsoever. The only evidence we've seen are pictures of AK-47s and some ammunition, boxes of ammunition, and some cash as well in a mosque. all this is unverified footage from Syrian TV. This is the only evidence that's been presented so far of any kind of foreign involvement. Now, Daraa, the focal point of the protests, is known to be a conservative city. It's a clan-based city, and all these clans are known to be conservative and also very much not likely to be in collusion with Western powers or Israel or any other sort of anti-Syrian forces.
Andrew Tabler, the Syrian government, saying that Syria is targeted by foreign powers because of its support for the resistance in Lebanon, in Palestine and elsewhere. Let's face it, wouldn't some neighbors, including Israel, be happy to see the government in Damascus fall?
That's unclear. Of course, it's a major policy goal of the United States, as well as Israel and a number of other Western allies in the region, to break Syria away from Iran. There are two general ways to do that. Until recently, we've talked about getting them to sign a peace treaty with Israel. That would be one way to break that alliance with Iran, although that doesn't seem to be now very possible. The other would be for the regime to be seriously weakened, or for the regime to come down and a Sunni-led government come to power. So those are the two options, and no one really knows where it will go from here.
Blake Hounshill, do some foreign powers have a stake then in also stoking the sectarian tensions? After all, Syria is a close ally of Shia Iran. It has had very tense relations with Sunni Saudi Arabia and its allies in Lebanon. So would it suit some of the countries in the neighborhood, some of their vested interests, if the regime there were to fall?
I think, you know, if you're talking about Saudi Arabia is likely to be of two minds here. Saudi Arabia doesn't want the precedent of Arab dictators being overthrown to get established any further than it is already. On the other hand, I think you're going to see a lot of sympathy here in the Gulf toward Syrian Sunnis, and I think a lot of people are watching these scenes on Al Jazeera, very alarmed at what they're seeing, and they see Syria as aligned with Shiite Iran. So I think you're going to have a debate that's going to play out, and if things get more violent, I would expect Saudi Arabia to weigh in more strongly on the side of the people of Syria.
Malik Al-Abdeh, how concerned are you about these sectarian dynamics that are coming to the forefront?
Well, I think all Syrians are extremely concerned. What's happened in Latakia was an unprovoked attack on the protesters by a gang called Al-Shabiha. Now, this gang is notorious in the Latakia region. It's made up of predominantly Alawite members, those very close to the regime. Some of them are even members of the Al-Assad family, and they're known to be criminal in nature. They're involved in carjacking and drug smuggling. And they're the ones who actually attacked the protesters, according to eyewitnesses. Now, who ordered them to attack, no one quite knows. But Latakia is a mixed city. There's Alawites, Sunnis, and also Christians as well. And the choice of Latakia to be the city where these Shabiha gang attack protesters, I think, was a calculated move in order to incite sectarian hatred. I think personally the regime is trying to play the sectarian card. They want to divert the democracy revolution in Syria to become a civil war, and that will obviously delegitimize the revolution, and that will also give carte blanche for the regime to use excessive force and deadly force to crush the revolution.
Blake Hounshill, how significant then is it that these protests have spread to places like Latakia, where the Alawis are believed to make up some 2/3 of the population there? Does it then suggest that this protest movement is more widespread, more indigenous than the government is saying?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the Syrian government has misplayed its hand badly, you know, by attacking protesters in Daraa. And people all over the country in Syria have seen what's happening, and they're upset about it. You know, there were people walking down the street in Damascus chanting, you know, with our blood, with our souls, we sacrifice for you, O Daraa. So, you know, the regime has only itself to blame here for the fact that these protests have really gone countrywide. Having said that, they're still not very large by the scale of, you know, even relatively speaking, what we saw in Tunisia and Egypt. It's still a relatively small situation in Syria right now.
And if the situation does become more and more unstable in Syria, Andrew Tabler, how much of a challenge would it then be for the US's main ally in the region, Israel?
It has a lot of implications, but I think the primary way to look at this in the short term is that very clearly, Syria is as if the protests grow, and I think that they seem to be, that Syria is going to be turning inward. Now the question is, do they turn outward? Do they try and stoke events or with their allies like Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip? And recently we've seen some tension there. So it's a standard playbook for the minority regime in Damascus to try and cause a problem with Israel to deflect attention away from domestic concerns.
And I ask you about Israel because I should note that the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, to which you belong, is known to be very close to Israel and the Israel lobby in the US. So for the United States, let me ask you again, would it be more important to see a weakened Syria in the region, or more important to try to safeguard some kind of stability to make sure that this kind of unrest doesn't then also spread to places like Jordan?
Do they want to see bloodshed in the region? No. Do they have an interest in a weakened Syria? Yes, because Syria is an adversary of the United States. But again, it's very unclear where this is all going.
But is U.S. policy, though, is U.S. policy being driven first and foremost by the Israelis' interests in the region, more so than the U.S.'s vested national interest?
No, it's being driven by U.S. interests first, and then, of course, the U.S. has many allies in the region. By the way, it's not just Israel that has a problem with Syria. Saudi Arabia has historically, Egypt, many other regional allies, Sunni allies in the region.
Blake Hounshaw, the U.S. and its allies are all obviously invested in Libya at the moment. How much more vital, though, is it to Western interests what happens in Syria because of all its ramifications on the region?
Well, you know, the U.S. doesn't really have a lot of interest per se in Syria, but the United States has sought for years to broker or help foster some kind of agreement between Syria and Israel. And I imagine that there are, you know, a lot of different conversations, a lot of discussions and arguments going on in Washington right now. But certainly one argument being made is that they're worried about the future of the peace process with an unstable Syria, you know, a population in flux, a government that won't be able to make any sort of deal. Now, I personally think there's not going to be any deal anytime soon, but there are a lot of people in Washington who think that way.
Going back and looking at the situation on the ground, Malik Al-Abdeh, if the situation continues to deteriorate, should the U.S. and others intervene in Syria to protect civilians the way they did in Libya?
Well, I think Secretary of State Hillary Clinton actually stated that don't expect the United States to get involved in Syria the way it did in Libya. I don't think the people in Syria want necessarily the U.S. to get involved. I think the revolution at the moment is, the course of the revolution is peaceful, it's democratic. People don't want a civil war, people don't want foreign involvement. People want real fundamental reforms, and I think so far it's not necessary for foreign involvement to get involved. Now, I think it's very important at the same time to send a message, a very clear message to Bashar al-Assad's regime, that if he continues to kill people in Daraa and elsewhere in Syria in the way he's been doing the last week, then obviously the international community will come down very hard on him. They will try to isolate him and remove the veneer of international legitimacy, and I think that will be very, very damaging for Bashar. Already, I think his allies in the region, some Arab allies, also Turkey, they've been leaning on him very heavily to make democratic concessions. That possibly is an explanation why he's decided to lift the state of emergency, or so we've been hearing, although details have not been very clear. So Bashar al-Assad is he's got a vested interest in maintaining the international legitimacy and maintaining good relations with the West and with regional allies.
Blake Hounshaw, the U.S. intervened in Libya, of course, to prevent what it says was a slaughter of innocent people. Why not do the same in Syria if dozens of people continue to be killed?
Well, you know, I think it's a lot of why the U.S. intervened in Libya is because there were calls from within the Arab world, and there were thousands of people on the streets of Benghazi calling for U.S. airstrikes and cheering the coalition airstrikes when they happened. I don't, like your guest said, I don't think that's going to happen in Syria. There's a lot of anti-American feeling in Syria, and I think Syrians want to manage this situation by themselves, and I think the United States recognizes that.
Andrew Tabler, the situation may be different between what's going on now in Libya and Syria, but live ammunition has been used against protesters who are unarmed. Dozens of people have been killed so far. The UN has said this is unacceptable, yet the US has ruled out any involvement Why do you think is Washington so cautious? Is it for fear of what could come after Bashar al-Assad if his government falls?
Hillary Clinton has come out and said that that seems to be off the intervention seems to be off the table. Of course, we've heard these kind of things before. The situation is fluid. I think that they're giving Bashar a way out by announcing that he can announce and implement these reforms which we've been waiting on in Syria for over 11 years. So if he does that, perhaps that's a path out. But it's unclear. The U.S. could also change its mind. But they're very cautious because of the makeup of Syria. They don't want to see further bloodshed. Beyond that, we'll have to watch from day to day.
But why is the U.S. willing to see the implementation of reforms in some places and not in others? In some places like Bahrain, Yemen, Syria, but not in places like Libya?
Because every country has a different foreign policy for a different country. There are general principles, but the situation in every country is different. The situation in Libya is different than the situation in Jordan or in Syria. So, again, policy changes incrementally in response to events on the ground.
Blake Hanshaw, let me just ask you this. Is also part of the reluctance to get involved in Syria and the desire to get involved militarily in Libya have also to do with the fact that Libya holds Africa's largest reserves of proven oil, the 9th largest in the world, more than 40 billion barrels of oil. Does that fit into the equation at all?
I think only at the margins. I mean, the reason that the West went in and intervened in Libya is because there was really an impending humanitarian disaster coming at the hands of the Gaddafi regime. Libya is a relatively simple ethnographic country when you talk about Syria, which has, just a patchwork quilt of ethnicities and sects. It's a very fragile country. I think we should be very cautious about talking about outside intervention in Syria because, it's a real delicate situation and any outside involvement can only make things worse.
Malik Al-Abdeh, you said you were against any outside involvement. How much faith do Syrians have in their president? Is this all about seeing the people around him, the regime, come down and not so much the president himself? Does he still retain a certain level of popularity?
In some quarters, yes. But I think as the general population as a whole, I think we've over the last few days, we've seen his pictures torn down. We've seen a statue of his father brought down in Dar'a, in Homs. Again, his images were defaced. So I think his popularity has taken a very, very strong knock. And it's been very hard for him to regain the aura of the president. So far, he hasn't appeared in front of the camera. There's a lot of rumors going around that maybe he's not really in control of the situation. Maybe his brother is in charge, Maher al-Assad, who's known to be a not very stable character. So I think Bashar al-Assad has to appear on camera. There is talk that he will make an address at some stage. But he has to appear on camera and he has to set the record straight. He has to apologize to the people for what's happened. He has to promise very swift reforms, not just promises of reforms. He has to announce them instantly to regain the situation. I think time is not really on his side. I think it's a question of days rather than weeks.
Andrew Tabler, do you see it that way? From your knowledge of the country, do you feel that Bashar al-Assad is very firmly in control of the security situation in Syria?
Well, obviously he's under tremendous pressure, and obviously these protests are gaining momentum. The thing in the case of Syria, which is different, Syria is a minority regime, and the minority networks that are around the Assad family overlap in the military and the security services. So it would seem that the system is galvanized against for example, military splitting off and acting independently. But as we saw in Egypt and Tunis, which led to the ruling family coming down. I think what's going to happen here, though, is it depends on how the protests go and what the choices are of the president. And then after that, you could see some kind of split in the days ahead.
Blake Hanshaw, do you expect a split when you look at the backbone that the Alawi military elite has formed in the country for decades, the backbone of the al-Assad regime? Could you see any split from among them, from within their ranks, or will they want to hold on to the status quo?
I don't think this regime is capable of fundamental change, frankly. And I think the way the sectarian and ethnic makeup of the country is, the Alawi core of the regime has got to be terrified right now. And I think they're probably willing to do anything in their power to stay in control, and it's going to be very bloody. I'm prepared to be surprised. I would be happy if Bashar al-Assad got on TV today and said, we're going to turn over into a real, genuine democracy. But I don't think the leopard can change his spots that easily.
Malik Al-Abdeh, do you expect this to be bloody, or will Bashar al-Assad have learned the lessons of the massacre that took place in Hama in 1982, where his father ordered his troops to quell an uprising? And the numbers there, the estimated numbers of dead, according to Amnesty International, are anywhere between 10,000 and 25,000. Could we see this kind of a repeat?
Well, obviously anything is possible. Of course, the lesson of Hama is that you can kill as many people as you want, you can punish the people, and that will guarantee you at least another 20 years in power. That proved very well for his father, worked out very well for his father. 1982, the massacre was committed, and he remained in power until his death in 2000. So perhaps Bashar al-Assad wants to do the same in Syria and guarantee at least another 20 years in power. I think we're in 2011, not 1982, so I think the situation is very different. And I think the Syrian people are reacting in a different way. The Hama was an armed uprising. It was led by the Muslim Brotherhood. I think the revolution at the moment in Syria is extremely different. It's peaceful. It's not led by an Islamist movement. It's a genuine grassroots movement. So I don't think Bashar can really repeat the same as Hama, even though he probably has the power, the military power to do the same. But I think the people's reaction is extremely different.
Blake Hounshaw, how do you see the future of al-Assad's rule? His father was in power for almost 30 years. He's been in power for 11 years. Could this prove to be the end of his rule, these uprisings that have been sweeping the region and that seem to eventually be making a stop in Damascus, or could he survive this?
I think he still has a chance to nip this thing in the bud and stop the momentum of the protesters. But it's just doesn't seem to be in the nature of these Arab dictators to do the smart thing, to do the morally right thing, and step out of the way and offer genuine democratic reforms to their people. We haven't seen it from anyone in the region yet, and I don't think we'll see it from Bashar al-Assad. So I expect the situation to snowball and develop further.
Malik Al-Abdeh, are you willing to accept some of the promises that have been made in the last 24 hours that there will be political freedoms and that there possibly will be the lifting of the emergency laws as well?
I think people will be willing to accept them if they're a part of a timetable of reform, a clear timetable. However, that hasn't been announced yet. All that's been happening are simply promises, and people don't really trust the regime anymore, because over the last 10 days, we've seen a host of lies, and more lies by the state propaganda machine, trying to blame the protesters on infiltrators and foreign agents. I think people are outraged. And therefore, trust in the regime has really, it's at zero right now. I think, if Bashar comes out on television and says something and really declares a new chapter in his rule, I think that might placate some people. Maybe some sort of the middle class protesters, especially in some of the larger cities, that might placate them. I don't see that happening, however, and I think I have to agree with your guest that things will only snowball.
Andrew Tabler, finally, what kind of bets do you think will be made in Washington about the future direction things are taking in Damascus?
Obviously, they see that I think Bashar al-Assad has, in terms of domestic legitimacy, very little based on reform. He's made some small changes. If he goes off in that direction, I think everybody has an interest in that. His primary means of legitimacy is resisting Israel. And that, of course, seriously, I think in terms of U.S. policy, seriously undermines U.S. attempts to try and foster talks between Israel and Syria. A Syrian president with increasingly narrow base would have a harder time pursuing talks with Israel, which apparently in the country are grossly unpopular.
Andrew Tabler, Blake Hounshaw and Malik Al-Abdeh, thank you all very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. You can also share your thoughts with us by emailing us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the team here in Doha, thanks for watching.